Howdy, y'all. With the Pro Tour just finishing up and a brand new standard meta on the horizon, I thought it'd be a good idea to just make this quick video to address some of the top performing decks and talk about what to expect in the future of standard these coming weeks before the next set ends up coming out. So I see no better place to start than looking at the #1 deck list from this last Pro Tour, Nathan Stoyer's Selesnya Landfall. Now, obviously, you're going to see some pretty key staples in green landfall decks. You're going to see Badgermold Cub, you're going to see Llanowar Elves, you're going to see Mightform Harmonizer, Saz's Chocobo. These are all things that we've seen in previous iterations of Landfall. There are a few things to note that make this list different than previous lists and, you know, kind of push it over the edge of what Landfall used to be able to do. The biggest upgrade from Secrets of Strixhaven, of course, was Erode. Not only are you able to target your opponent's stuff and be able to get through some extra damage, but Erode can also be used as an extra way to get more landfall triggers if you end up targeting your own Earthbent land. You can even, in niche cases, target your own other small creature like a Badgermold Cub or a Llanowar Elf if you really need that extra landfall trigger to get you through. This card by itself kind of bridges a gap that this deck was missing a little bit. Not only is it a way to get your landfalls triggered, but like I said, it interacts with your opponent's creatures as well. The biggest change from regular landfall lists before is probably in the reduction of how many Ice Till Explorers are being played in the deck. If you even look at Nathan Stoyer's teammate, Christopher Larson's deck, he's only running one Ice Till in the entire 75. This was for a little bit considered kind of the most broken card to run in Landfall as like the main engine maker. And I guess with all the graveyard hate and, you know, with how much better some of the other tools in the deck interact with everything else, Ice Till Explorer, you usually can use as a finisher, so you don't really need more than two. I do agree with Nathan, you should probably run two, but seeing more than one, there's just not really a point. The hand can get bogged down by a bunch of these, and then you just end up milling a bunch of cards, and now you don't have anything on the field. I can agree with that. The other weirdest addition to the deck is definitely Diadrin, Synthesis Amalgam. On paper, this kind of just looks like a really bad Selesnya counters mid-range unit that you might not even want one of in any decks. But it has some niche use case. Obviously, it's one way to draw cards in this deck, and that is one thing that this deck has been looking for ages, is just a way to draw some cards. Diadrin gives you a little bit of that, while also giving niche use case of being able to remove counters from Earthbent lands. So if you have a Earthbent land that has 1/1/1 counter on it, you could then, say off of a Badgermold Cub, you could then remove the counter on the Diadrin's attack trigger if you're able to remove one more counter, say off of a Diadrin. And then you'll draw a card, you'll make a 2/2, and then you'll get your Earthbend trigger, so you'll get another landfall. That can be another way to get some extra landfall synergy in there. Plus, just having a decent mid-range unit to play when you're in top deck mode and you're not running any synergies on the field, it can just be a semi-powerhouse of just something to do. We're looking at 2 Bushwhack in the deck. It's just small interaction. Being able to have your 2/2 land from Earthbender Ascension or something be able to fight your opponent. Slick Shot show off while it's a 1/2. It's kind of necessary. Plus, it helps fix the mana if you do end up having to play Bushwhack on turn 1 to fix your hand. You can totally do that. Lumbering World Wagon is seeing a return in this deck. It was kind of cut from landfall decks for a bit, but the removal of some Ice Tills did make room for Lumbering World Wagon, and I do agree with this. You just get a lot of ways to be able to crew this, and of course it has the combo with Mightform Harmonizer to just basically kill your opponent if they have no way to block it. And then, of course, for Earthbender's Ascension, I do think this card is what makes the deck so good. It earthbends a land, it finds a land for you, and it also has its own landfall ability. It does way too much in one card, and if you're able to resolve this and just have one out, you feel so much better about the game than if you're missing it. The deck also runs a couple of one-ofs, Keen-Eyed Curator, as a way to like interact with your opponent's graveyard while also representing a type of mid-range unit, so that way you're not really wasting 2 mana on something like a Rest in Peace in your main board. When in the matchups where you don't actually want to have a Rest in Peace, this ends up being a better card. Mossborn Hydra, of course, being a staple landfall card and a great board in response to something like Spellementals, where their main source of removal is based on the elemental typal. You do get to also run one of the Surrak. Again, for at least the Mossborn and the Surrak, the extra 2 copies are in the sideboard, and then you get to board them into the matchup post game 1. I do believe this is likely due to the open decklist nature of the Pro Tour. If you get to see your opponent's deck and you know that you need to look for a specific card like a Mossborn Hydra or like a Surrak in order to like mitigate the matchup a bit better, you might actually end up taking that extra mulligan if it really is that important. That being said, the one-ofs here I would not consider crucial in matchups unless it's Keen-Eyed Curator into something like Spellementals or Prowess. Moving on to the lands, obviously we're going to try to run some basics. That is the downside to Selesnya Landfall versus Mono Green Landfall. You are a bit limited on how often you're able to fetch for lands. So obviously we're still running the 4 Fabled Passage and the 3 Escape Tunnels, but because we're only running 9 total basics, so that way we can have a way to still get our white and our green, the deck runs into some falters. If you do end up accidentally finding all of your basics, you can do a fail to find. And so again, that's another reason why I think some of the Ice Tills were cut for this list specifically, is just if we're running less basics and less ways to fetch, then Ice Till Explorer plus Fabled Passage just has less value. But yeah, we're running 7 forests, 2 plains. White is basically a splash in this deck, as a way to get your Erodes played, Diadrin, and then a lot of sideboard pieces. But that being said, we still have 4 Hushword Verge. It taps for green first, so this is just a great land to have. If you have it in your opening hand, you're really happy. Boss Sing Se, of course, if we're running a bunch of basics, this is usually going to come in untapped, and that lets us further our game plan with Earthbend 2. Escape Tunnel is just another way to fetch for a land, but it also has niche use case of being able to give something unblockable. So instead of needing to rely on Earthbender Ascension Trample, for instance, we get to use Escape Tunnel to get through a little bit. And then, of course, Temple Garden, just a couple of them as another way to get some dual land sources. Moving on to the sideboard, I do think this sideboard is a bit interesting. I would make some edits personally, but let's go through it really quick. 3 Rest in Peace. This makes sense because one of the deck's toughest matchups surely is Izzet Spellementals, or at least the one that you would be the most worried about. If you get to resolve Rest in Peace versus Izzet Spellementals, you kind of just win the game. So being able to play this and as early as possible, it's pretty useful. So running 3 of it makes sense. Shelter by Ghosts, just a great way to interact with your opponent's units while also buffing up your own creatures to stop them from being removed. With that ward 2, you get that lifelink. Very, very, very efficient. Mossborn Hydra I already talked about, but basically you want to board this into the Spellementals, and anything that you're sure can't really get rid of it. Mossborn Hydra's biggest weakness still being Burst Lightning, unless you have a way to buff it through. You usually don't want to see this against Izzet, but against most other decks, Mossborn Hydra is just a huge value engine. Snakeskin Veil, of course, being a staple in this deck, running so few ways to like get value. You need to protect that value, and so Snakeskin Veil gets you there, along with Restoration Magic. The one of Restoration Magic, of course, basically being a third Snakeskin Veil, but it has niche use case of being able to give your whole board hexproof and indestructible, which can stop things like board wipes. But with how the main board wipe this ends up stopping is Day of Judgment and Ultima, but the one it still doesn't actually end up stopping, unfortunately, is going to be Day of Black Sun, since that does remove all of the abilities, so just have to be careful about that one. The extra 2 Surocs are in here. You want to board this in anytime you know they're going to run target removal, say against a mid-range deck, or even Izzet, and you need to get that extra card draw going, especially if you're on the draw. And then it's running 1 Voice of Victory, 1 Kutzil, basically for the same reason as each other, but the Kutzil is a little bit of a different kind of text. So Voice of Victory, obviously, white staple, lets you play the game on your turn, and your opponent has to play the game on their turn, and that Mobilize 2 just gets to punch in for a bit extra. The Kutzil, however, has the same effect. It costs 1 more mana, so the question is, why are we running it over a second Voice of Victory? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The decks that you want to play Voice of Victory against, you typically want to avoid Spell Snare. So running a way to get past Spell Snare it's kind of techie for that instance. Alternatively, it also says whenever 1 or more creatures you control, each with power greater than its base power, deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So if you chip in with a Diadrin or an Earthbent land, you just get to draw a card every turn. So this can turn into a bit of an engine, especially in the matchups where you really, really, really need to rely on that card draw. So being able to build up a board, then interact with just a couple of pieces, but leaving like maybe your Earthbent lands, and then you play Kutzil, Malamé Exemplar, and then you swing in with those creatures to get some card draw. It can be pretty useful. So that is Nathan Sawyer's version of Selesnya Landfall. I guess there's not too much to change on this deck. Like I said, if you're going to go into, let's say, an RCQ and it's not open deck list, I would highly discourage these one-ofs and just pick either running the Surocs or the Hydras in the main, and then you can or maybe even like run 2 or 3 Keen-Eyed Curators in the main instead and just cut these 2. You don't necessarily need the one-ofs if you're not knowing what you need to look for until you already see your opponent's deck, and at that point, sideboard's more important. Moving on to Roy Zhang's version of Izzet Lessons. As I mentioned in the previous video, this deck is nearly the same as it used to be. There are no additions from the new set. We didn't even consider adding the slow lands, even though this might be one of the better Izzet decks to add a slow land to. The mana base is just already incredible. No reason to do that. Notable changes from other people's Izzet Lessons lists. I did want to talk about the mana base first. They are running 2 Agnikellas instead of 1. I do think this is correct. There are some matchups where you just need to get that discard trigger, but your opponent isn't like representing anything to cast spells with, so this is one way to get you to cycle through, and being able to see 2 of them in a game instead of 1, sometimes that helps. But outside of that, the mana base is basically the same. Gran, of course, being the main starting engine of the deck. It's not only a great turn 1 play if you know you don't need to Spell Snare or anything your opponent's 2-drop. You get to get the attack trigger, or tap trigger, sorry. And as long as you have enough lessons in your yard, you get to make sure your Accumulate Wisdom is actually your Ancestral Recall. This version's running the Artist Talent plus Monument to Endurance combo that we saw from the World Championships, and has been the, in my opinion, most successful version of Izzet Lessons. It's just pretty consistent. This deck is definitely one that if you want to learn a deck and stick with it until rotation, this is probably as close to consistent as you can get. Obviously, this is going to run as many lessons as possible, but the main few cards that we want to talk about are Consult the Star Charts. This is a bit different from other people's Izzet Lessons lists, where they might end up running just a few more lessons in the main board, or maybe even some extra boomerang basics instead of just the 2 right here. The Consult the Star Charts I do like. It lets you do something with your mana if your opponent didn't present a threat that you were holding up an instant speed interaction for, and it puts cards in the hand in a deck that can grind out games if it really needs to. And then the 2 copies of 3 Steps Ahead, that's been kind of a staple we've seen on Moto for a while. It has a lot of use case with its modes. Not only do you also have the option to draw 2, discard a card to trigger your discard on Monument, you can counter your opponent's spells if you really need to cancel. And the biggest one, of course, you get to copy your Monument or your Artist Talent if you so choose. Being able to copy those is really huge since you only get 4 copies of your combo piece, and the more monuments you have out, the better. If your opponent has interaction or removal for one of the monuments, it's nice to just have a second one out. But on top of that, just getting the double triggers basically solidifies the game in your favor, and there's no looking back for the most part. Moving on to the sideboard, Flash Freeze, of course, a card very good, ready for both Izzet decks and Landfall decks, and yeah, that's a good reason to run 3 of these in my opinion. Plus, any 1 in a blue instant you might value higher in this deck than other decks because of how much cost reduction you have with the leveled up Artist Talent, or with Grand being online with enough lessons in the yard. Negate just being a good catch-all, especially into the mirror match or into control decks. Being able to stop a Jeskai Revelation, or just as a catch-all hit anything, it's pretty useful. 2 Quantum Riddler, in case you need to hit that mid-range, sort of look just adding more threats to your deck because your Monument game plan may not work. Same thing with the Rawl, Crackling Wit, and the Storm Chaser's talents. These are just new cards, not new cards, but different cards to add more threats to your opponent. So you would board this into control matchups and the mirror match, and you might actually end up on top, because if you're playing the Lessons mirror match and they don't end up having Storm Chaser's talent anywhere in their 75, you actually have a pretty decent chance as long as they don't draw that Iros. One of the Boomerang basics made it to the sideboard. I guess they felt it was worth it to run 3 total, so they just threw the 3rd one in the sideboard because they didn't have room. Broadside Barrage is a staple in Izzet sideboards now as just a good catch-all. Not only does it kill every single unit in Izzet Spellementals, but it also just hits Planeswalkers really well, especially Rawls that just +1. And then we have Spell Pierce, just a good catch-all, like I said before. Basically the same thing I said about Negate, but this hits the smaller stuff. So against Landfall, you do want to board this in to make sure you're hitting their Lumbering World Wagons and their Earthender's Ascensions. And then you have the Spell Snare. You board this into anything that yeah, this is really good on the draw. If you can hold up a Spell Snare and stop their turn 2 play, and that's just incredible tempo, even if it's not putting a lesson in the yard. So, like I mentioned, the list, it's not too crazy, but Zhang was a fine player, played really well. I watched the top 8 game versus Azorious Tempo, and it was something. But yeah. Next up, I did want to take a very quick look at Matt Nass's list. Matt Nass is an incredibly good player, and the fact that he was able to take this deck and make top 4 with it baffles me. It is just a generally good pile of green-white cards. You could just call it Selesnya aggro at that point. Having seen him in the area and gone to RCQs that he's been at, he's been on the Gear Hulk train basically since the last Pro Tour. where he ended up playing Bant Rhythm, but I do believe he decided this time around that Rhythm's not fast enough in the main board, and you kind of need to make sure that it doesn't get countered, so you have to board it into non-blue matchups, even though it is such a good card. So I guess we'll go through it really quick. Obviously, the Badgermill Cubs, you'll have Gene Pollinators and Llanowar Elves. These are your ramp pieces, and they also just add units to the board, which is super useful. Keen-Eyed Curator, being able to run 4 of these is just really good tech against most of the meta, because it was expected that there would be a lot of prowess. Paw Patch Recruit, not only a good turn 1 play, but also a good turn 2 play if you have a Llanowar Elves out. This curve out is nearly unbeatable if they don't have a way to deal AoE damage, like with a Pyroclasm of sorts. Ouroboroid, obviously your late game finisher. A lot of decks had a tough time dealing with Ouroboroid, and I do think that's why this deck ended up being well slated, on top of the fact that Matt is incredibly proficient with this deck. It ended up being that I think we got to see his matchup versus Izzet Spellementals during Swiss, and he was able to rip out Keen-Eyed Curator on turn 2, and his opponent didn't have a response. So the fact that happened solidified that winning game 1 against probably the worst matchup makes it to where you have a better chance post sideboard because of that board and rest in peace. But yeah, outside of the Spellementals matchup, I don't think this deck has honestly that bad of matchups. It also likely loses to mid-range and tempo decks, but as we saw from the metagame breakdown, most people didn't actually end up bringing tempo decks. People wanted to bring either Prowess or something that beats Prowess. And I think this can get there, especially with boarding in the Erodes post sideboard. Then we take a look at Sage of the Skies. I do think this is another cool tech card that was added. It's just another way to go wide. So if you can play a Gene Pollinator or one of the ones that you searched up with Bright Glass Gearhulk, like a Nurturing Pixie, but you weren't able to find that 5th land, you can play the Sage of the Skies, and now you just have another unit on the board. And the 3 toughness is pretty huge. Lifelink is important. This card ended up doing pretty well, I think, for this deck. And then, of course, the big name that people have actually been calling this deck now is Selesnya Gearhulk instead of Selesnya Ouroboroid. It's because you're still running this Bright Glass Gearhulk. You want to get it out as fast as possible, usually turn 3, but hopefully at least by turn 4. And then you search up for any 1-cost piece that you really need in that moment. So you find your Paw Patch Recruit, you find your Llanowar Elf, you find your Nurturing Pixie to put Bright Glass Gearhulk back in your hand. You find Seam Rips to deal with your opponent's... what is that card called? You find your Seam Rips to deal with your opponent's Slick Shot Show-Offs. You find your Melt Strider's Resolves to deal with your opponent's Slick Shot Show-Offs. Or if you're playing against something like Lessons, you board in Insidious Fungus, and you get to fetch for that, and it deals with your opponent's Lessons stuff if you can't find the Seam Rips for whatever reason. And then we go to the lands. Not much to write home about. It's just a pretty basic aggro 2-color list of cards. We want to prioritize forests because we have most of our turn 1 plays are green. And I say most, pretty much all of them, unless we have to rip a Seam Rip on our opponent because we went second and they played a Llanowar Elf. Yeah, we would prefer to have that green source. So we're running all the Temple Gardens, all the Hushwood Verges, and then Starting Town as a cope card because we don't have the Selesnya Fastland since that rotated with Phyrexia. And then 4 copies of Abandoned Air Temple. If you're going to be going wide, might as well replace those 6 copies of Plains to be this card instead. Very, very useful effect, and can really get your creatures out of range of damage removal, which Izzet really, really relies on. Moving on to the sideboard, like I said, the Nature's Rhythms had to go somewhere. They went to the sideboard. you really only bring them in if you know your opponent can't play Spell Piercer Negate, so that way you can get that Crater Hoof turn if you really need it. But most of the time, this deck didn't end up needing a Behemoth turn. It just relied on Ouroboroid or Gear Hulk to get there. 3 copies of Erode deals with your opponent's creatures pretty mana efficiently, and if it's the turn you're about to win, you don't care if you're giving them a land. Rest in Peace, of course, like I said, very useful in current meta. Spider Manifestation, very useful if you do end up boarding in the Rhythm. And then the Behemoth is your finisher when you do board in the Rhythm. And then we have the one of Insidious Fungus, like I talked about. And then this very interesting addition, Focus Fire. So this was a draft card from Edge of Eternities. And it says it'll deal X damage to target attacking or blocking creature, where X is 2 plus the number of creatures you control. It does mention Spacecraft 2, but this deck has none of that, so don't worry about it. So it's just a good way to deal with your opponent's creatures while you have stuff. Plus, it's not even a bad, like, by itself. It's kind of just bad Elspeth Smite if you really need it to be, but sometimes that's good enough. Deals with Slick Shot Show Off just fine. So yeah, I did want to talk about this list for a little bit. I don't know how much this list will actually show up in the wild, and I kind of hope it does because it's really cool. I just don't know how good it is. All right, next shout out. I did want to talk about Stefan's mono green landfall deck. He ended up making top 8, but then lost out in the first round. This is basically what we saw before, but just making sure to mainboard those Edge Rovers and Dragon Snipers to be able to deal with Slick Shot Show Off pretty easily. Other than that, we're not seeing much of a difference between this and previous iterations of Mono Green Landfall. So, yeah, 4 copies of Ice Hill Explorer. Nothing to write home about. Pop Hatch Formation, still seeing play because it is a good board, and again, against those flyers if you need to deal with them, but can deal with when your opponent tries to bounce back their Storm Chaser's talent to hand. You can stop the loop by destroying that enchantment, and that basically 2-for-1s in a way, since they're not going to be able to replay that as a creature. Royal Treatment just being this deck's version of Snakeskin Veil. It's fine. It's the same. Instead of a counter, it gets an enchantment. Sapling Nursery, of course, being a decent board in against those grindier matchups, and you get to play this in mono green versus your Selesnya deck because of that affinity for forests. This card would not be very good in Selesnya because you have a harder time getting that forest affinity going. 1 Cavern of Souls in the sideboard. I do believe this is likely just to make sure if you need to stick a Hydra, you can stick that, or if you need that Harmonizer to go off so you can win the game, you board this in, wait until you need to play the card, then you play the Cavern of Souls, naming whatever you're about to make sure needs to not get countered while your opponent's holding up stuff, and then swing in with that Might Form Harmonizer victory. And then for whatever reason, the 4th copy of Might Form is in the sideboard. I guess likely to make room for that one of Dragon Sniper. Probably would have put that in the sideboard if this was not a open deck list event. But as I mentioned before, that does typically incline you to want to run these one-ofs. That way you know what you're mulliganing for on game 1. Next up is my favorite deck list from... I should probably adjust this properly. Next up is my choice deck list from the last season of RCQs I ran. It's Spellementals. This deck is really cool, and I appreciate the team, The Boulder, so much just for making this available to people's minds out here. First thing I did want to note, 19 lands. In a deck with 4 opt and 4 sleight of hand, I did think that the bare minimum you should run is 20. People were running 20 when it was the Boulder playing this deck at the last Pro Tour. But we're down to 19. And we're cutting one of those islands. So running the Multiversal Passage. I agree with that, of course. It's just sometimes you need the red is all it is, but you don't really care about the life total that much. Obviously, the deck still did well even with 19 lands, so it must have just been prepared to mulligan semi-aggressively, which kind of makes sense. This deck has probably the best top decks out of any deck in the format right now. Obviously, we have the main combo with Spellementals. You get to play a bunch of spells, fill out the yard, make sure your Eddy Merc Crab or Hearth Elemental is cost reduced, and then you get to play your Sunderflock reduced by either the cost of Hearth Elemental, so by 6, or the Eddy Merc Crab, so reduced by 7. Obviously a very powerful combo, and if your opponent has only non-elemental creatures out, you just get to Cyclonic Rift them, so that's always nice. The deck, of course, like I said, 4 opt, 4 sleight of hand, just the simplest ways to put things in the yard. But I did want to point out the biggest prediction I made for the deck was that it should run 4 copies of Prismari Charm, and it does look like I was proven correctly. This card not only has the potentiality for the modal pieces, but that Surveil 2 draw card is the biggest one you're trying to hit with this card. If during your Surveil 2 look you find 2 spells and you're able to bin both of them, then you'll have, after the Prismari Charm resolves, 3 more spells in the yard. So if you go turn 1, opt or sleight of hand or burst lightning, turn 2, Prismari Charm, putting 2 spells in the yard and then drawing a card, then on turn 3, if you're able to play a land, your Eddy Merc Crab is playable. That is the earliest that this deck has been able to play the Eddy Merc Crab. And I think the high roll potential of Prismari Charm, while its modality is decent, gives this deck a little bit more of the edge. Obviously, the original intent with the deck was to make sure that you're spending 1 mana per spell in the yard at least, or at minimum, like at most. So obviously the opt and sleight of hand is there. You've got Burst Lightning, that's 1 for 1. Spell Snare, 1 for 1. Get Out, of course, this is kind of a sideboard piece. The card is pretty useful against removal, but more importantly, it's basically just a better Essence Scatter. So in Prowess, which is trying to kill you based on their creatures, it's just another way to do that. Or you can send back an Eddy Merc Crab or a Sunderflock back to your hand on your opponent's end step, so you can replay it the next turn. One of Spell Pierce. Weirdly not any more copies in the sideboard, but this card shouldn't be played in large amounts. Flow State being another card that doesn't necessarily follow the mana rule that I just presented, but that's because this card's card advantage is insane. If you're already going to be engaging with the graveyard, you might as well try to run some Flow State. Winter Night Stories, of course, being 3 spells for 3 mana. You're not trying to discard a creature card unless you absolutely have to and you needed to keep certain spells in your hand, but typically you're trying to play this or discard this from a different spell and then discard 2 spells. And then, of course, that Harmonize is activatable with any of your 12 main-boarded creatures. 2 Impractical Joke, just a good catch-all card that deals with Keen-Eyed Curator pretty well. And then the weirdest one that I saw was the Heroes Hangout. So thinking like this versus an island, I don't know which is correct. You're never using that second mode. So we're looking at that first mode. Slight card advantage. You look at 2 cards, you get to choose which one you want to play until end of your next turn. So it's kind of like balanced impulse draw. You don't get to play both cards, you just get to play one. But you do get to see more cards, and it puts an extra sorcery in the yard, which is important for cards like Flow State, where you do want to hit this critical mass of sorceries to instant ratio. Obviously, instants being more powerful than the sorceries, it's a little annoying, but because we also got that Impractical Joke, we were able to reach this like 16-13 split, and then of course the sideboard can help change that a little bit if we needed, but that ends up making the flow state go online more often. Moving on to the sideboard, weirdest addition I've seen in this deck before, Hexing Sculpture. I think it's fine. It's cool that your spells can't be countered. So like if you're able to play, I think the idea is you play this and then you play the card you want to make sure can't be countered, or if your opponent's about to kill this, then you cast something so they can't, like, I don't know. It was seen as a decent like mono red aggressive piece for a bit, but that 2 toughness kind of puts it in the garbage in my opinion. I'm not sure. I do think this could be 2 other cards. I'm not sure what they could be. We'll keep going, but this sideboard is, in my opinion, suboptimal. 2 Hydro-Man. This card's really weird. You don't think you'd be running something from the Spider-Man set in this outside of the Spider Sense, but this card is just a really good card. When you are playing against black in particular, they likely will board out their requiting hexes because they know that there's no targets in it in your main deck. So then you board this in, and now there's a threat to your opponent that they might not want to actually end up using their instant speed removal on, and sorcery speed removal just doesn't work because it does turn into a land. So it does dodge things like Strategic Betrayal. Pit of Offerings, like I said, this sideboard's weird. This could have been Soul Guide Lantern, but it's this card instead. I don't hate this as an idea. Usually the graveyard you're trying to hate on is also in red-blue, but it does mean you're playing a tap land. You're playing 2 tap lands in your deck, so I don't think you actually want these to replace lands in your deck. I think you want these to replace some of your instants or sorceries. And then, yeah, you get to exile only 3. This is land speed, so you can only do this on your turn. And then I guess it taps for red or blue later. I don't know. I would have preferred this to be other cards, like I said, like a Soul Guide Lanterns instead. Moving on, Raw Crackling Whip. There's basically an argument to whether you're supposed to run this card or Legend of Kurik, and I think it's meta dependent, but both of them are basically really good board-ins. When you know this Underflock game plan's not going to work, you just have another out that your opponent may or may not have interaction with. Abrade, obviously just a good quick deals 3 if you really need some extra ways to deal with your opponent's stuff, like if you're on the draw, but it also deals with artifacts, which puts it well slated against something like Izzet Lessons. Annul, of course, being a very good board in against Izzet Lessons as well, and kind of against Landfall as long as you're able to hit something like Earthbender's Ascension, but it's hit or miss on how good that can end up being. Broadside Barrage, like I mentioned before, it's a staple Izzet card that deals with stuff like Delian Fell, your opponent's Rawl, your opponent's Spellemental creatures that have that 5 toughness. Disdainful Stroke, just a good catch-all, especially if there is still rhythm in the meta, and it was kind of up in the air if people were going to actually end up bringing rhythm or not to this event, and it unfortunately it kind of turned out that there wasn't, so still a good board in against something like Jeskai Control, since most of their win cons are based on high-cost spells. Second copy of Get Out, like I said, in this deck it's basically Essence Scatter with upside because of how many blue sources you're running, so might as well run this instead. Ghost Vacuum. There's a graveyard piece that I agree with. The targeted removal it nichely comes up as important, especially if your opponent is Hellbent, but they have a Storm Chaser's talent out. This Ghost Vacuum feels really good. And then the last one being Sky Crash, just basically another copy of a Braid, but it has cycling for red, so in a way you spend 1 mana to put 1 spell in the yard yet again. I think you should kind of either go one or the other. If you need the artifact hate, you can play either Sky Crash or Ouroboroid, and then obviously a null is there too, but you have a lot of ways to be able to deal 3 to things with Impractical Joke, and maybe even a kicked Burst Lightning, but I don't know. It's kind of one or the other. If you really need that artifact hate, I don't think you need one Sky Crash and one Ouroboroid. I kind of think you just need to pick one, and I think Ouroboroid might win over just like a little bit because it has modality. So that's Max's version of Izzet Spellementals. Looks pretty good. I do think it's well slated still for future RCs and the Spotlight series that's coming up this weekend. But I don't think it's the best Izzet deck by far. I just think it's well slated. And if you're good at piloting this deck, you get rewarded pretty well, I think. All right. This one's definitely the wildest to see in top 8. Zevin Faust did end up bringing Azorious Tempo, and I do think he would have gone farther if he did not get basically land flooded on a couple of his games against Roy Zhang. So a bit unfortunate. I do think this list is incredibly good, so let's go through it. The first card I do want to point out is High Noon. No, this deck does not have a lot of ways to use that second mode on there, but that first mode is probably the most important part of this entire deck. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. So the main focus of this deck is, of course, if your opponent can only cast 1 spell each turn, how do you manage to get an advantage from that? And that's by playing stuff with flash usually. So obviously stuff like Flood Pit's Drowner and this new Sky Coach Conductor, they have flash, but the main 2 pieces interacting with your opponent's spells is going to be Aang Swift Savior and Aven Interrupter. These cards stop your opponent from playing the rest of their turn most of the time if their turn requires them to play a spell. They cast a spell on their turn and then you Swift Savior or Interrupter it while you have a High Noon out. They have to wait to cast that spell, and so now they don't get to do anything. They have to wait till your turn to do something, and by that point, they might not even have instant speed interaction. So, of course, this leaves you with a body on the board. Aven Interrupter, of course, comboing pretty well with Aang, because if you do end up airbending a spell while also having an Aven Interrupter out, that airbend spell does cost an extra 2 more. So this combo has been sought after for a while. I do think Zevin was the first player to make this list work really well in his favor. Moving on, like I mentioned, Flood Pit's Drowner, it's just another great tempo piece that has flash. Sky Coach Conductor, probably being one of the better cards in general from Secrets of Strixhaven, in my opinion. And there was talks of making some kind of Azorious scam deck where you could play this alongside Quantum Riddler, which this deck does run, but we'll talk about that in a second. Where you like warp in either Quantum Riddler or Starfield Shepherd, and then you can flicker it with stuff like the Sky Coach Conductor's spell All Aboard, or with the new Daydream or Slash Portal. It ended up not being a deck in huge favor, and you know it's interesting because one of the most brought decks was Azorious Momo. And while this list has a bunch of flyers and could run Momo, it just chose not to. And I do think that ended up being something to talk about. This deck list looks incredible. But yes, like I said, Sky Coach Conductor's prepared spell does let you exile something that's not a Sky Coach Conductor, basically, because there's not much other pilot-typed cards. So your opponent casts a spell, and then you flicker your Aang. Your Aang re-enters, it airbends the spell, and now their turn's over again because you had a High Noon out. Again, this deck, if you are able to cast a High Noon, locks your opponents out, and if you're not able to cast a High Noon, you still get to play this little tempo game that your opponent has to play around. Voice of Victory, of course, going really well with High Noon. If they can only cast 1 spell a turn and they can't cast spells on your turn, do the math. They can only cast a spell once and between land drops. Quantum Riddler just being a good staple card for a deck like this, giving you extra card draw, being a flyer. Not bad. It's just very good. The one of Beza is very interesting. I could see this being useful versus something like Landfall, or just finding a way to get a little bit of extra life total versus a Prowess deck. Something you're not able to deal with super well, and then it also gives you that extra card advantage if you're playing against like a control deck. So, and plus being able to flicker this with Sky Coach Conductor, it's just a pretty decent combo. So I can fully understand this card being run in this deck. Moving on to removal suite, we've got 2 Get Lost in the entire main board. Like I mentioned, most of this is going to be interacting with your opponent's spells with Aang and Aven Interrupters, so the Get Lost is kind of just a just-in-case emergency, but you don't really want to actually cast too many of these. And then Spell Snare, if you're going second, you just play some kind of blue source, and then you're able to counter your opponent's 2-drop, so that way you're able to resolve your High Noon the next turn. Avatar's Wrath, pretty good board wipe. I'm not sure why it's showing the wrong language there, but basically you choose one, up to 1 creature, so you don't have to choose anything if you don't want to, and then it airbends all the rest of them, and then your opponent's not allowed to cast cards from exile on their next turn. So not only does this combo with itself, where you're not able to cast the cards that were just removed from the board, but they can't cast anything that they decided to not play from their airbend zone with Aang, or not played with their Aven Interrupter. Plus, since it lets you choose one that didn't get airbent, you can choose one of your own creatures if you only have one, or if you just really want to like replay and have your retriggers, you can do that. So if you don't choose a Sky Coach Conductor, you get to replay Sky Coach Conductor for 2, and then do the all aboard for 1. So that's like a 3-mana flicker with a 2/3 body, still pretty good. And then just as a little fail case again, Airbender Ascension, sorcery speed, you get to airbend something. And then when a creature you control enters, you'll put a quest counter on it. If it has 4 or more, at the end of each of your turns, you get to do a little flicker. This means you can put, if you have Airbender Ascension out, and you have High Noon out, and you have Aven Interrupter out, and you have Voice of Victory out, stuff like that. Like there's a lot of combos to get you there, but that's just one of them. You can lock your opponent out of the game. Yeah, as long as you have like Sky Coach Conductor out, if you have a blue up, you can flicker your creature that you were about to counter your opponent's stuff with, and yeah, they're locked out of the game. They might as well scoop. Going to the lands, it's pretty basic blue-white. 25 lands makes sense for a deck like this, since you do kind of have a top end where you do want to make sure you're at least at 4 mana, and you have decent card draw with cards like Quantum Riddler. So 4 Floodfront Verge, 4 Hallowed Fountain, 4 of each basic, 4 Starting Town, Abandoned Air Temple, since you're already kind of going wide a little bit-ish, and have those flyers, putting counters on them just closes out the game faster. Restless Anchorage, Multiversal Passage, pretty normal blue-white mana base here. And then sideboard, running 2 copies of Annul, just a great board in for Landfall, but also for Lessons if you're expecting that. Disdainful Stroke, interesting that there's 2 of these. I think they expected, maybe Zevin expected a lot more rhythm in the meta, and there kind of just wasn't. So Disdainful Stroke ended up not being maybe boarded in nearly as often as they thought, maybe? I'm not sure. Flash Freeze, of course, just being a really good board in against Izzet and Landfall, like I mentioned before. Ghost Vacuum being their graveyard hate of choice. Seeing no Rest in Peace while they're in white is a little confusing. I'm not sure why you wouldn't just run Rest in Peace instead. Maybe they were scared of getting Spell Snared or Annulled, especially against something like Spellementals, where they're basically boarding in only when they see white. They board in only to make sure that the Rest in Peace doesn't resolve, so that way they can play the game. So I'm not sure. And maybe it's also like, oh, it's a value engine. You can get rid of your own stuff in your graveyard, and then you can replay them. And I don't know. Moving on, Seam Rip is just a really good way to deal with your opponent's Llanowar Elves if they're in green, something like that. This is a really good card when you're going second. A second copy of Beza, just adding more threats back into your deck when you're playing against control, or just a way to deal with your opponent's go wide strategy by having a couple of extra blockers, gaining some life, etc. Pretty good card. We're running one Petrified Hamlet. This card was added to Secrets of Strixhaven mostly as a way for other formats to have some kind of new land hate. In this case, you likely would, if you expect your opponent to have an Ice Till Explorer soon and they have Fabled Passage in the yard, you can play Petrified Hamlet and their Fabled Passage has basically no text. I don't know how much I agree with this because they could also just fetch in response to you playing this, since it's a when this land enters ability, not as it enters, you choose a card name. So it does like put the card name. So it does like put the card name trigger on the stack. I don't know how good this ended up doing. This card is fine, I think. I'm not sure if it's worth taking a whole sideboard slot for, though. Moving to Pyrrhic Strike, a card edition from Lorwyn Eclipsed. Just gives you a type of disenchant that also lets you do both modes if you blight 2, if you really need it. It's pretty decent. I'm not sure if I would run this over just actual factual disenchant, though. The fourth copy of Quantum Riddler. Again, for similar reasons that you would board in Beza, you would board in your fourth Quantum Riddler. And the last card added from Spider-Man here is 1 and a white instant Spectacular Tactics. You can either destroy a creature with power 4 or greater, or you get to put a counter on a creature you control and give it hexproof. So it's just a little bit of fail-safe if you really need it. So yeah, this list is really, really cool. I think Zev and Faust cooked absolutely with this one. And I would not be surprised if we saw some more Azorious Tempo builds later with, some more refining. I do think the sideboard could use a little bit of refining, but outside of this, I think Zevin is an incredible builder. Making a whole game plan around High Noon is crazy cool. Yeah, very cool tempo deck, and I'm glad it did well. Now, I just went through all of the unique lists in the top 8, but obviously Izzet Prowess did not make top 8 at the Pro Tour, so I did at least want to shout out one of the Izzet Prowess lists that I didn't think should have or could have most likely ended up in the top 8 contention. Most notably, this list would have been top 8 if it had won its Game 3 against Nathan Stoyer. So let's take a look at it really quick. So this list is from Thierry Ramboa, a French Pro Tour player here, running quite a few just like regular cards you would typically see in Izzet Prowess. We've got the 4 Slickshot Show-Offs, we got the 4 Storm Chasers Talent, 4 Boomerang Basics, 4 Opt, 4 Sleight of Hand, 4 Flow State. Pretty regular. I just think this pilot's cooking and had a few other tech cards that I think can matter in certain matchups, but usually you want to try to find a way to discard these in other ones. So we'll go through that really quick. First of all, Colors from Stallion. It's really good in the mirror if your opponent has no way to deal 3 damage. Outside of that, I think this card's really bad. It just, like I mentioned in my previous video, this card just kind of gets blocked by Earthbent lands, and then you're sad. It has no evasion. It just has haste. The word 1, it's minuscule, but it doesn't come up super often. And the only way to trigger that magnum opus when you get the copy is if you're able to kick a Burst Lightning, which doesn't happen often enough because usually you're just trying to kill your opponent with multiple prowess triggers. Running only 2 crab in the main, as opposed to the Moto favorite of running 4 crabs. and in one case I've seen before running 4 crabs and 1 hearth elemental, just as a payoff for playing all these spells. If you're not able to get through with the prowess game plan, might as well put something out on the field. It's pretty simple. And then the last creature that was added here is Drakecatcher. This card is a little outclassed. I don't know if this is even remotely a little bit better than Elusive Otter. But I think it's a really cool card. I would like to wonder how often the Drakes actually ended up mattering. But Vigilance Prowess is a crazy set of keywords. Having that extra toughness makes it to where it gets Burst Lightning harder, and if your opponent does end up trying to Impractical Joke it, you can actually just play an instant spell to get it out of range of the kill, and then your opponent basically has wasted some kind of damage removal. So I can see why this card would be run. I just don't know how useful this ended up being. But it's really cool. I think Drakecatcher is one of my favorite cards from Foundations, and it's nice to see it get some play. Moving on to the instants, we've got Burst Lightning, obviously. I mentioned Opt before. 2 copies of Secret Identity. The Moto players can cope. This is the better way to save your creatures, even if it does reduce your Eddy Merc Crabs down to being a 1/1, or your Colorstorm Stallion back to being a 1/1. Plus, it's just a way to punch in if your opponent is tapped out. You can actually just get a little bit of extra damage in with that 2 extra on Slickshot or Drakecatcher or one of your Auber tokens. Into the Floodmaw, just being a general good way to bounce your opponent's stuff, regardless of if it's creature or not. And it's nice that you can basically Stone Rain your opponent if you really need to. Prismari Charm, hitting non-land permanents with it, but the biggest mode still being that Surveil 2, draw a card. Fixing your hand is really important, and having that tacked onto a modality for being able to bounce your opponent's non-land permanents is still pretty good. 1 Spell Pierce, talked about that before. Don't really want more. And then the sorceries, like I said, 4 Boomerang Basics, 4 Flow State, 4 Sleight of Hand. That's all pretty regular. And then we're running 1 copy of Plasma Bolt. Now, Plasma Bolt is sorcery speed shock, but it's sorcery speed bolt if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn. So in order to trigger the void, the most common line would likely be if you Boomerang Basic something. But I guess you can also get that off of Floodmaw or Prismari Charm. But being able to deal 3, like I mentioned before, it can come up, and it does come up, where you still want to get rid of that Colorstorm Stallion that other people are playing. And then, like I said, 4 copies of Storm Chaser's Talent. Metabase, nothing too crazy. Just making sure we're running 21 lands in Izzet Prowess is pretty important, because you do kind of need that top-end lands for the grindier games, because sometimes you do have to grind out, and then you end up leveling up your Storm Chaser's Talent to get stuff from your actual card draw spells from the yard, and then replay them and keep the game rolling. Sideboard, running 2 Annuls, good card. In general, just a meta assumption is all this is. To get out, since every land in this deck can tap for blue, like I said, this is just better Essence Scatter, so might as well run this instead. Plus, it has the niche use case of being able to bounce back something like Eddy Merc Crab or Storm Chaser's Talent back to your hand for replay. Or, as I'm about to point out, Roaring Furnace. The Steaming Sauna, you rarely unlock. The Roaring Furnace is kind of just another way to be able to deal 3 to something, at least. So it's really good in the mirror. It deals with some of Landfall's stuff like Keen-Eyed Curator pretty well. Card's fine. I've never been a huge fan of this card, but it does make it to where your Boomerang Basics have a few more targets. Moving on to Seer. It's Seer. It's either this or a Braid, and if you're already running 2 Annul, I could see why you would just want to run Seer instead. Plus, it hits Planeswalkers, so if you do run into that random Kaido, or your opponent's playing Delian Fell and they end up having to minus to kill one of your creatures, you can punish them by Searing it instead. Moving on to Soul Guide Lantern. It's Soul Guide Lantern. Graveyard Hate. Pretty simple. Disdainful Stroke, another meta call, just making sure that you can make quick use out of those rhythm decks, but likely wasn't boarded in much because not a lot of rhythm and not a lot of control. One Hydro-Man, very interesting. Haven't seen much Hydro-Man in Prowess, which I think is super cool. I think this card is really good for Prowess, but I'm not sure if it's so good as to cut one of the copies of Rawl. This went down to 1 copy of Rawl total instead of 2. I'm not sure how much I agree with that, but regardless, making sure you run at least 1 helps you in the mirror match and versus control decks pretty easily. And then the second Spell Pierce, needing to board this in when you're on the draw can be pretty useful. And the last sideboard slot he used ended up being for Stock Up. I'm assuming this is just kind of like Flow State copy number 5, because Prowess did used to run Stock Up before Flow State came out, but Flow State is literally just a flat replacement that costs less. So I'm assuming that's the main use case of this card in games where you're going to need to, like the card says, stock up on more cards. You have the ability to do that now. So that is the decks I wanted to talk about. Let me know if you think I missed any decks that you thought did well enough at the Pro Tour for me to talk about, and I might feature them in a future video. But these are the main decks I wanted to talk about that you should be expecting to see in your soon to come up standard meta, and make sure your deck can beat. There is a Magic Spotlight in London this weekend. I would like to see a metagame report of that soon before the event starts, but probably not too far earlier. So I may or may not be able to have an upload for that on Friday, and if I don't, I'll have some kind of upload during the weekend. But thank you so much for tuning in. Y'all's support has been incredible. If you want to check out my last video where I ramble a bit about the state of the Pro Tour and how this last Pro Tour went and state of standard right now, be sure to check the video up there. And yeah, that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed this video, and peace.